Hello, YouTube. Today I've got a couple socialists talking about the calculation problem, and I'm going to let them know where they're wrong.
Basically a meme, the E.C.P. What is the calculation problem for people that don't know what it is? What is it all about?
Okay. Basically, it arises as a problem from the 1920s. During the period just before the First World War and then during the First World War, the Austrian economist Neurath started to talk about what war economy teaches us. He first started talking about that when he was observing the Balkan War, which immediately preceded the First World War. And then he became more concerned about it during the First World War when he was involved with planning for the Central Powers war economy. And what he was saying was that what war economy teaches us is that what matters is not stocks and shares or money.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it there. The E.C.P. was advanced by Ludwig von Mises in his epic work, um, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And basically, what Mises says is that there's simply no way for a socialist economy to rationally allocate scarce resources, specifically in capital goods industries. So it's not really a problem for consumer goods because you can just pull up anytime a good comes off the shelf, you can just sort of signal that it needs to be replaced. That's simple enough. The socialist economy should be able to handle that. But when it comes to allocating scarce capital goods, what needs to be produced? Iron or steel, or do you build more factories, or you build more roads? There's no way to know. So in a market economy, in a true market economy, where the roads were privately produced, owned, then prices would allocate scarce resources for everything. What we have is sort of a mixed market where the roads are done by the state, so they're not. We have basically road socialism, is what we have. But for every other industry, for example, for housing, that's sort of a bad example because of the regulations that impede it. But um, so so for food, okay, uh, if people start eating more pork, then the and if the demand for pork increases and the supply of pork stays the same, then what happens is the price increases. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, so you go up in the demand curve, the price goes up until equilibrium, and this is a signal to entrepreneurs that you can make money by producing more pigs, more pork. So that's how the market sort of determines what should be produced. If there was a copper shortage, then the price of copper would go up, and this would lead to people importing copper from overseas. If if there was a sudden demand for televisions, again, price would go up, or a shortage of televisions, price would go up. If there was a glut of televisions, if everyone stopped watching TV, we all became enlightened philosophers and started reading books or watching Netflix on our computers or playing video games, but we weren't buying TVs for whatever reason, then the price would go down. Factories of production would be realigned. People would start producing other stuff, producing graphics cards instead of televisions. So, so that's catalactics. That's how the price system allocates scarce resources. It's fundamental to economics, and this is the problem with the socialist country. A socialist country Basically, the state is planning everything in this socialist example. We're not talking about worker collectives. We're talking about state nationalized all the industries, which is, in the 1920s or 40s when the debate was going on, this was what socialism meant back then. This was the conception of socialism. So they're saying, the state's going to plan everything, but it's not going to know what capital goods should be produced.
It's command over real physical resources. And
Oh, by the way, they're going to say their solution is going to be what Oscar Longe said, which is market socialism. Pretend to have markets.
when you're running a war economy, you're having to plan amounts of food, you're having to plan amounts
So the war economy was highly planned, like America, World War II, great degree of planning too.
of raw materials, you're planning munitions, you're planning clothes for the troops, you're ensuring the basic supplies of food for the civilian population. And this means that the government can no longer consider the matter just as a matter of money and self-regulation of the economy. It has to actually take control and start regulating and allocating resources. And his argument was that this is the real economy. This supply of real goods is the real economy. And the counterpart to that is the meeting of real needs, ways of measuring the extent to which the population's needs are actually being met. Are they adequately clothed? Have they enough calories? Have they enough coal to heat their houses, etc.? And this is different from the approach of monetary economics. And he was saying what you need is a system of calculation in kind in these physical quantities. And he was an advisor to the Bavarian Soviet government before it fell. And later the context was of, within Austria, the social democratic movement was strong. And ideas like von Neurath's, not von Neumann's, Neurath's were having an influence. And the right-wing Viennese thinkers, right-wing Viennese economists, reacted against this and put forward the claim that it was impossible to rationally calculate how to allocate things in kind. And the first person to put this out was a guy called von Mises, who was another Austrian economist, but a right-wing one, whereas Neurath was became a left-wing economist. I don't know whether he was really left-wing, say, before the First World War, but he certainly was afterwards. And of course, this is the time when the Russian Revolution has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
They're attempting to run war communism with great difficulty under the disrupted conditions that exist, with the government only controlling a small part of the country, etc. And Mises' argument was, in fact, it would be impossible to carry out this calculation in kind. He said that without some way of evaluating the relative costs of different projects to achieve a given end, you couldn't choose which.
Yeah, see, none of these socialists have ever actually read Mises. His argument is specifically related to capital goods industries. This introduction to the book says it best. In the socialist economy that Mises described, consumption goods are freely demanded and exchanged by individuals of different tastes. Money can exist, but only within the limited sphere of the market for consumer goods. In the sphere of production, however, there is no private ownership of the means of production. They are not exchanged, and as a consequence, it is impossible to establish prices that reflect actual conditions. If there are no prices, there is no method of finding out the most effective combination of the factors of production.
Which was the most efficient. Unless you knew what the different costs were, you couldn't operate rationally, and you'd be blundering in the dark. That's basically what he was saying. And the key point was
Alright, he seems to actually state it pretty well.
this alleged claim that without prices, you can't do rational calculation.
Right.
Um, Now that would have had a certain superficial plausibility at the time. There were immediate responses by
Oscar Lange.
socialist economists, a variety of them. On the one hand, you had people from the left communist currents that you could carry out the calculation in terms of labor value. That if you want to compare the cost of two different things, the thing which uses the least labor is the one you choose.
Right.
And there were also
That's stupid. I mean, especially the way he phrased it. Like, because it's not a binary choice. It's how much steel and how much coal are you going to produce. It's not like you're only producing steel or only producing coal. What percentage of society's resources should be allocated to what industry?
responses of different forms from other people. There was a guy called Riemack, who was a German mathematician, who, this was in the late 20s, faced with the recession there, came up with a proposal again that you should calculate what was required in terms of matrix algebra and pay everyone according to the amount of labor that was done. And if they did this, he said, you would solve the unemployment problem, because there would then be, if there was no capital income, there would be sufficient revenue of the workers to buy the full product that was being made. And he's the first person to have proposed using mechanical calculation to do this.
That's the great saving grace of socialists. They want to say, now we can just have computers plan the whole economy. In fact, in Argent, no, in Chile, when Allende tried to seize power, part of his great plan was a massive computer calculating everything, cyber something, but never got beyond the demo stage. But computers won't do it. What you need, because basically what prices measure is the subjective and varying changes of everybody, not even just in society, in the society in question, but everybody in the world, because you're trading internationally as well. So, how do you measure the changing needs of 8 billion people? What is your algorithm to calculate that? You can't do it, but the market will do it effortlessly simply through the price system.
This is about 1928. He suggests
And that's why capitalism is the end boss of economic systems.
that it could be done with electromechanical calculators, which
It can't be.
were just, they existed, but they were the latest technology of the time. Then in the 30s, you got another set of neoclassical trained economists like Langer, Lerner, Dickinson.
I love the contrast between these guys' walls. Like the hardcore aged Marxist on the right, whose wall is just like a utilitarian white wall, and then on the left you've got this young hipster Marxist with the Engels book and some Soviet propaganda posters that he probably bought on eBay for $200 or something.
who basically said, well, neoclassical economics provides us with the technique to do the calculation in a socialist economy. And in fact, their claim was that the only circumstance in which neoclassical economics really applied was for a socialist planned economy. So by the end of the 30s, it was generally accepted that the
Now, neoclassical economists did place too much emphasis on the evenly rotating economy. I will accept that one critique of leftists about neoclassicals, because it's not about the economy being in equilibrium. It's about the economy struggling towards equilibrium.
socialists had won the argument.
Mhm.
And obviously, real world events affect the perception of people as who's winning. Because by the mid 30s, there was the most awful recession across America and most of Europe. There'd been mass unemployment. Uh, there had been during the 20s and early 30s an aggressive program of actually cutting down industrial capacity because it was felt there was too much capacity. Here in Glasgow, they closed down the most modern shipyards, the one with the most modern equipment, which had recently been built at Dalmuir.
Right.
A huge shipyard at Dalmuir was closed down, bought up by the other industrialists, and closed down in order to prevent competition. So it didn't appear that the free market was doing well. And at the same time, the USSR was, unlike the period in 1920, seen to be doing very
So the whole period from like 1870 to 1928, 29 was a period of just massive economic growth and prosperity, new technology being invented. So capitalism was crushing it up until the stock market crash in 1929. But then what happened was, so there was a crash, uh, and things were whatever. They weren't good, but they were going to get better. It was not going to be a serious problem. Unemployment was at like 8%. And because what happened was in 1914, the U.S. went off the gold standard. Now, technically, they were still on the gold standard, but they were on like a quasi gold standard. Prior to this, banks were actually making their own money. They had banknotes, which were demand deposits for gold, and people would use that as money. And then in 1914, the Federal Reserve was established. And now the private banknotes were still circulating, but instead of being redeemable for gold, they were redeemable for Federal Reserve notes, which were redeemable for gold. So, in the free banking system that existed prior to the establishment of the Federal Reserve, if a bank gave out these private banknotes that weren't backed by gold, what would happen is they would be deposited at another bank, and the bank would call upon the first bank for redemption in gold. And if they didn't have the gold, then they would be bankrupt, and they would be subject to a bank run. So they had to have the gold. There was no because what happens is when you have bank credit expansion, it basically mimics a larger supply of loanable funds. There's more money being lent out, so the interest rate goes down. It's the same thing as if people had been saving more, and then those funds would be available to be loaned out, driving the interest rate down. Supply and demand. Um, so so because this bank credit expansion mimics consumer time preference being lengthened, it leads to the misallocation of resources, the malinvestment of resources in capital goods industries. This is the Austrian theory of the trade cycle. So that's what happened in 1929, and the stock market crash was those investments being reallocated, but it wouldn't have been that bad. And then what happened was Smoot-Hawley. So they passed this tariff bill, this really bad tariff bill, and so everybody around the world got involved in a big trade war. Okay, so everybody started raising tariffs because, well, they're idiots, and and this ended up being really devastating to the agricultural sector of the American economy because they were exporting all this food around the world. You know, because people are hungry, they got to eat. And in America, you have a lot of land, so big agricultural industry. Um, so so they there's massive downturn in the agricultural sector because of Smoot-Hawley and the retaliatory tariffs. And this in turn caused all these rural banks to fail because they were engaged in expansionary lending, and and because the farmers couldn't repay their loans. So so that's the second phase of the crisis where things would have been okay. Things would have been fine, but for the double whammy, the Smoot-Hawley and the failing of the agricultural sector, which led to the rural banks failing. And then, to make matters even worse, Hoover tried to stabilize the price level and keep prices high, keep wages high, get that economy rolling again. Well, what happens in recession is falling prices because there's less demand. So that's what you want to happen. You want prices to fall until they reach the market clearing rate, and then at least they're not sitting on the shelves. Even if you have to make some losses, and even if wages have to go down briefly, at least everybody's still employed. But they kept the wages high, and this led to massive, widespread unemployment. And then they justified that unemployment by saying, well, let's get welfare relief and all these government works programs, which required really high taxes. So they started raising the taxes, and that's the last thing you want to do during a recession. Economic activity is already slowed down, and the government's just taking more money out of the economy, and there's less real wealth to go around. But again, these weren't failures of the market economy, failures of capitalism. These were failures of government policy, every single one of them.
So the uh, the Austrian claims at that point had very little credibility. It's felt that later on they became more credible. They started to become credible in the really late 1970s. I remember being astonished when I was a student economics teacher.
Mhm.
Um, I gave up school. Oh, well, I was fired actually for strike union activity. But at the time, I was still a junior school teacher, and was astonished to be hearing a school inspector who gave me a lift home, and she was saying, "Oh, have you read Hayek's Road to Serfdom?" I thought, surely people aren't taking this stuff seriously. It, everyone knows this is nonsense. I mean, when I studied economics in the early 70s, Hayek wasn't taken seriously.
Right.
But during the mid to late 70s,
So he's right that the economic establishment sort of rejected the Austrian school of economics, and really this came about with Keynes, because the Misesian theory of the trade cycle was sort of coming into the mainstream, and then Keynes published his general theory, which didn't refute the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, but it just sort of replaced it, like the latest fashion of clothing. And Keynes's general theory was nonsense, self contradictory, and just poorly written, and wrong, completely wrong. But it had the advantage of enabling politicians. It says, look, you can use monetary policy, you can use spending policy, you can spend, to get us out of recessions. Politicians love that. They love spending because to them, spending is power, right? So, because it's not their money, but if they spend it, then they can enrich their cronies, the special interest groups, where you can't do that if you're employing fiscal restraint. But then the 1970s, you had stagflation, you had high unemployment and high inflation. So at that point, you reach the Kuhnian crisis point where it's clear that Keynes's theories are no longer credible. So it would explain the revival of interest in the Austrian school at that point.
The capitalist world was going into a crisis. It was going into a crisis basically of low profitability and a declining share of national income going to profit.